PlayStation music off first.
What happened to your face?
Getting a bump, a pimple.
Shit. That's what you're going for. Yeah.
That shit hurt.
Leave it, don't do nothing to it until you see that little white tip.
Yeah.
And even then, still, let it get more fat, the white tip, and then you pop it.
Big. Then I got that show Sunday.
Honestly, you know I got downstairs, I'm gonna rub, you do rubbing alcohol too on your face to help dry it up.
Tighten it up, yeah.
So you don't have, so it doesn't leave a nasty scar.
I was looking at that shit. I felt it yesterday.
Ooh, my tits. You feel it better?
Why did I go to this?
Why did you do that?
It's not, I pressed the wrong thing, yeah.
Ooh, now they know below the knees.
Alright. But see, there's only certain controls you can't control off the PlayStation. You gotta use this app. Turn that music off. Do that. And to flip the camera around.
Right, from side to the which side, right? Yeah. I like it better that too.
But that, because if you do it,
I feel like it's weird.
it is because it's fucking. Everything is in reverse. It's like, and I hate most streamers who do this shit and don't flip their cameras. Like,
So
bro, just
yeah,
just flip the camera around. And it don't take that long. Turn your music, even with the music playing. People would keep that music playing. Like, yo, that is so annoying. I would watch this stream, but you just got that regular PlayStation. Like, turn that shit off, yo.
Somebody soda.
Boozy. What it do?
They really beat me.
Our next lecture looked at the critique of Eurocentric psychology. And we indicated then that the function of Eurocentric psychology, like the function of any Eurocentric discipline, is to maintain the status quo. Is to maintain, of course, European dominance. It doesn't matter whether it's psychology or sociology or economics or mathematics or engineering, whatever it may be, ultimately it is geared to maintaining that status quo. The function, we said, of Eurocentric psychology is to cure our people into sickness. That the very cure itself represents illness. Because if that cure is designed to adjust our people to...
Well, thank you very much for that generous...
Did I just do that by accident?
Yeah, you put one of the videos on the back.
Our next lecture looked at the critique of Eurocentric psychology. And we indicated then that the function of Eurocentric...
Dr. Amos Wilson, but I would like to give a brief synopsis of his disposition. Number one, Dr. Amos leads a professional career that has now established itself as status quo. He has appeared before many public forums, including radio and television guest appearances. He has lectured at a large number of colleges and universities, including Fordham, Columbia, Temple, Tulane, New York, North Carolina A&T, Florida A&M universities, and others. He has also lectured before many groups, conferences, and organizations, both lay and professional, including the National Association of Black Social Workers, the National Association of Black Psychologists, the Rockland Children's Psychiatric Center staff. Twice he has been invited to appear before the New York State Assembly's Committee on Children and Families and the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. Dr. Wilson was called upon to testify before the Government Operations Committee, chaired by the Honorable John Conyers, regarding the National Institute of Health's Federal Violence Initiative. Dr. Amos has 4 profound books. One is The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child. 2, Understanding Black Adolescent Male Violence. 3, Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children. And 4, Black on Black Violence. Brothers and sisters, remember, we have to study. But most of all, we have to practice. We have to serve as an example, because the power of example is the most moving force. But it is time, almost the year 2000, that we must affirm that and truly be that beginning that never ends. So let's give a warm African welcome for Dr. Amos Wilson.
Thank you very much. It's indeed a pleasure to have been invited to speak to you this evening and to share this time with you this evening, and to wish you all the best of the coming year and the years to come. I'm going to talk a bit about special education this evening. I want to beg your indulgence, though, because for many people it may not appear that I'm talking about education directly. We have to be aware of the fact that sometimes we really may not serve ourselves so well when we appear to come directly at a problem such as special ed, you see. Because sometimes when you come so directly at it, you omit looking at the context of the problem. And we also have to watch the tendency, due to our being here in this system, to focus so exclusively on one issue that we ignore other very important issues. This system, for instance, tries to get us to talk about problems that confront us as people and not consider the political, economic context in which these problems are generated. And often, though we are well-meaning, when we do this, we end up not solving the problems. So I'll beg your indulgence, because I'm going to talk a bit about some things that may appear not to be directly related to special ed, but I think you will realize that they are. I want to start off by indicating that for the African in America, whether a slave or a so-called freedman, has always been subjected to a special education. And this is the thing we have to recognize. We have to forget that this thing called special education is something special. There's nothing special about special education. Black people have been specially educated from day one. We've always been the subjects of a special education. So this thing that you call special education is special education within special education. It's just a subclass of the general special education to which we have been subjected as a people and to which we are now subjected as a people. This is no less the case as being subjected to a special education today as it was in 1619 when we first set foot on this planet. And for the same essential reasons. That is, we are especially educated in this system for essentially the same reasons in 1993 as we were in 1619. I have told you often that there are certain things that remain constant despite all obvious changes. And it is very important that we as a people recognize the constants and not be deceived by apparent changes. We must recognize when the changes are engaged in order to maintain the constants, to keep the world the same. And many times, many of us are deceived by apparent changes, and we then lose sight of what is consistent in the world. I've talked then about what I call European constants, those intentionalities of Europeans that have been present since the 15th century, as far as we are concerned, are still present right here today and are expected by Europeans to be present into the foreseeable future. And no matter what has happened, these expectations have remained consistent. And if there have been changes, and drastic changes in terms of our relationships to Europeans, these constants have remained the same. And these changes have been engaged in to maintain them. Some of those constants you heard me mention, one of course which is very important, which we see operating in Africa today, which we've seen operating in Panama and Grenada, and which will operate in the future on the African continent and other places where African people are, is what we call the military differential. With Europeans who are 10% of the population, their continued dominance rests on their maintaining superior military force. In fact, to a great extent, our being over here today is the result of military differences. There is no intention for the Europeans to equalize that differential between Africans and themselves. That differential has been there since we met them, and it has really not changed up to this very moment. And we see it operating in Africa at this very moment. And there is the intention that it will continue to operate in the world. Hidden behind this intentionality are a lot of glorious looking things, such as non-proliferation treaties. The treaty that Bush just signed with Yeltsin, perpetrated in the name of peace, when it is nothing more than an intention to maintain European power by limiting the growth of military power on the part of non-European people. It has nothing to do with peace. It has to do with maintaining superiority and white supremacy in the world. So we must not be deceived by these games. To maintain the European, of course, has all intentions to maintain the economic differential. There is no intention for the European to see Africans as equally, economically equal with them, no matter what the talk is about. There is every intention for the European to continue to exploit African natural and human resources, no matter in what guise, even though he may appoint African so-called leaders and support African regimes. The intention is the same as it always has been, to maintain economic advantage of African people, to maintain the technological differential. These are constants. And we saw European technology as it was used against our ancestors. The intention is that it will be used in the future as it is used now. The Europeans intend to maintain the power of definition, which we will talk about tonight. Because special education, as we will talk about shortly, is a definition. And as I said, I think earlier today, before we get involved in a discussion of special education, we should ask, why have we permitted the Europeans to define what it is? Why do they have the power to do so, and why do we submit to their definition of our behavior as a people? So before you get caught up in the intricacies of whether tests to differentiate between the learning disabled and the non-disabled, you should ask first questions first. Who determines it? And why are they able to impose their determination on us as a people? It is through then defining the world, as we will elaborate, that the European manipulates the world and maintains his power in it. And therefore he intends to maintain that power of definition. He intends to maintain control of the domain of discourse. A great deal of the discussion today over the various kinds of curricula, the multicultural curriculum, the curriculum of inclusion, the African-centered curriculum, and so forth, are struggles with the European over who will define what it is important to talk about. What shall be taught and what shall not be taught. What people shall learn and not learn. What educational experience shall people undergo and not undergo? Because all of these are related to power and to power relations. And therefore, if the European is intending to maintain power and control of the world, he must seek to maintain control over the domain of discourse, to decide what is worth talking about, to decide what is news, to decide the subject matter of curricula of various types. There are other areas, the area, of course, of always making those things African secondary to those things European. These constants were there from the beginning, they're here now, and there's every intention for them to remain in the future. Despite the elevation of blacks to high-level jobs, despite, some amounts of assimilationism, and despite some multiculturalism in the schools and so forth, these intentions remain the same. And it becomes very important for you to watch the changes and how they maintain these things. Because if you are to gain power in the world, it must be these very things which must be changed, ladies and gentlemen. The education of Africans has always revolved around education for servitude. That has not changed one whit. I have warned in Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children that the main purpose of education is not preparing black children for jobs. It is not preparing them to work for white folk.
They got to set like
that. That is not the main purpose of the education of our children or our people. For if that is our main purpose, then it means another constant has remained in the world, and that's the constant of slavery under a different name. Now it's called looking for a job. With the same people having the jobs and the same people determining our wages. If you're talking about true change in the world, then you must educate yourself to create your own jobs and to employ yourself. But today, education for blacks, I don't care how high it is essentially still being defined in terms of servitude. And we think when we are educated in terms of how and where we will be employed by Europeans. That has to change. But the education of black people from 1619 right to this very moment has had this as a central tenet. Training black folk to serve white folks' interests. Training black folk to be as productive as possible for Europeans, with the Europeans owning the means of production. Education that was separate and unequal. And believe me, I'm not an advocate of integrated education. Education that was ultimately and is ultimately degrading to black people has not changed. It was that way from the beginning, and it's that way right now. Education that ultimately insults the history and culture of African people. Education that is Eurocentric, meaning an education that prepares black people to maintain European power as the central power in the world. Education of black people according to the white man's estimation of black intelligence and his need to shape and direct it. I've warned you before that you need to change the definition of intelligence before you get into an argument with Europeans as to whether their tests are measuring intelligence or not. You must ask, what is the political function of your definition of intelligence? What is the political economy of your definition of intelligence? And why is it that the way you define intelligence always ends up that means intelligent people work for you and your interest? So consequently then, we must recognize as an African people that the ultimate goal of intelligence must be that of preparing a people to solve their problems. The way intelligence is defined today and in America is such that if we as African people are said to behave intelligently, we are behaving in ways to perpetuate our oppression and to maintain European power over us. And therefore it becomes important to the European to define what intelligence is and to define how it is measured, and for us to engage in futile arguments as to whether it's caused by cultural differences or genetic differences, when it really is not even the point. According to Henry Allen Bullock, author of A History of Negro Education in the South from 1619 to the present, in the beginning there was no thought of educating Negroes. Yet the necessity to do so was always present. You see, ultimately the white man is faced with a dilemma. In his heart and way, he would not like to educate us, but the very structure and demands and dynamics of his economic system in a way forces him to do so. And so even though he had no intentions, and you can see in the history books some overt statements about not educating blacks, and of course if you read the history of Frederick Douglass, you saw the issue there of the slave master and his reading abilities, what kind of problems they created. But in a sense, the white man's education of the African man under white supremacy has been very ambivalent, both intentional and non-intentional. Bullock goes on to say that soon after the establishment of the slave regime in the American South, there was set in motion unintentional processes destined to introduce the first of many educational opportunities that Negroes were to have prior to the Civil War. Because we must recognize that the plantation system and the slave system was what we call a rational system, in the sense that it was an organized economic system and operated according to definite goals and intentions. And another expression of rational business practice in terms of the slave system of the South appeared in the attempts of planters to utilize their labor efficiently, you see. So if you've got an economic system, whether that system is called slavery or not, ultimately you want to make it function efficiently to get the greatest bang for the buck. A complex system of division of slave labor was instituted on every plantation, and all of this was done in pursuit of maximum production per unit of slave labor. If you would read the magazines during this period, you will see great discussions as to how to maximize production on the plantation, how the slaves, how to train them and how to motivate them so as to maximize profit. So within the broad limits of this rational system, he, the slave master, was expected to require and get absolute obedience, loyalty, docility, diligence, and other patterns of behavior considered essential for profitable production and survival of the slavery economy. Another constant that has not changed, has it? Not at all. For, ladies and gentlemen, this is the central essence of the education of African Americans today. To maximize what? Production for Europeans. And to establish in the African body absolute obedience, loyalty, docility, diligence, and other patterns of behavior considered essential for whom? For Africans themselves? No. Profitable for production and survival of the European economy. That's why we define ourselves in terms of our education as preparing to get jobs from Europeans. And how best to what? Qualify ourselves.
Now this is how radical technology is. Dr. Amos Wilson was speaking in the early 90s and saying, you know, because everybody's a wage slave. If you got a job and you pay taxes, that should go to major corporations, you know what I'm saying? And everybody's a part of the system. And the corporation needs everybody labor. But now, I don't know how big Dr. Amos was on technology, but just a generation from him, like, we're about to automate and AI everything. Like, I wonder if he kind of predicted that type of future coming. I can't really remember. I think he does talk about like how some automation in factories are pushing a lot of the blacks out of the unions and everything. That was one of his main things with the unions. But anytime somebody talk about the workforce, I just really see that coming. And I don't know, I worked in a factory for many years. And as soon as I started watching Boston Dynamic videos and seeing the type of robots they're trying to build, it's like, yo, in 50 years, 60 years, man, these jobs ain't gonna be here no more. If they got robots like that right now, man, they do that for another 40, 50 years. Yo. That's how iRobot was, like robots just doing all the mundane jobs. A lot of movies predict that coming, but like, we're closer to it than people thought, yo. Like, I've always been on science fiction my whole life, and I always knew like flying cars, and I just believed like I would see that. And then like VR is like one of the main things when I was little, yo, and like watching TV shows about virtual reality and how you can go inside a game, and like I got a VR headset, like I can really do that. And I already know like a lot of other technology that was like predicted in like the 80s and 90s science fiction, Back to the Future with the flying car and all that. Like, we're gonna have autonomous drones as taxis and delivery services, and those are a flying craft, a flying vehicle. It's not a plane. It won't exactly be a flying car, but basically the same thing. That's in my lifetime, like jetpacks, all that stuff. It's weird, yo. And Elon Musk talking about going to Mars. and he built his whole company out of trying to get to Mars, and that was just like some science fiction when I was a little kid. But now, like in my lifetime, all of this shit is really happening. Cars that can drive themselves, and even the cell phone. Like when I was a little kid, there was no cell phones and internet. I still find cell phones amazing, especially the new ones that we have. I mean, the tech has been there for a minute. They just keep upgrading it, but just like apps and FaceTime and all that, that shit was like some science fiction when I was a kid. You can't hold your phone and talk to somebody in real time where they at. Like that shit was like in TV. Now everybody can do that shit.
Mosquito in
Gotta kill that bitch.
To fit in the European economy so that we can aid its efficiency. The laws of every slave state backed the normative line which he, the master, could draw, and every slave was expected to fear the consequences of any deviation from the range of tolerance his master set. And we shall see again these rules that determine special education still have these things in mind, because these rules are rules that determine deviancy and non-deviancy. And their purpose is to correct deviant black behavior and bring it back in line with European economic and political intentions. And to create in our children personality orientations and behavioral orientations that are supportive of those intentions. These requirements, that is, set up by the European, set a rigorous sociocultural matrix within which young Negroes were to be socialized and were to become the personality types required by the rational order. And we're going to come back in a minute to what we call the political economy of the personality and the political economy of normality, you see, because we're used to looking at normality as a psychological concept and a psychological state. No, ladies and gentlemen, normality essentially is a political and economic state, not a state of psychology. So however, we've been deceived, you see. But we'll get back to that in a minute. All the slaves could not be efficiently utilized as the rational system required unless they were trained in the ways the system by law itself prohibited it. In a sense, the system broke its own laws in order to increase its efficiency. And even though it might have had laws against teaching slaves to read, slaves still were taught to read. And teaching slaves other things, slaves learned many skills and so forth. Why? And in a sense then, slaves started their education on the job in America and received on-the-job training. They also were hired out in other professions where they earned monies for their masters and brought the money back. With all due respect to Malcolm X, there were greater divisions than field hands and house servants. There were deep hierarchies of slaves with numbers of skills and so forth. The slaves not only worked in the house, or not only worked in the fields, but they worked throughout the Southern economy. They were millwrights and carpenters and blacksmiths and shipbuilders and all other kinds of things you can name. You recognize that in many areas of the South, after the emancipation, there were more skilled black laborers than there were white laborers as a result of their training on the plantations. And that is a whole nother story. And it's amusing today to see people talk about black people as unskilled, as if our lack of skills were here since we started. That was not the case. We had to be de-skilled as a people in this country. And those skills began right on the plantation. We were hired out. In a sense, then, the plantation was the first training school for African people. And to a great degree, the slave masters recognized, as they do today, that a trained slave could sell for more on the marketplace. And therefore, when you went on the auction block, the more skills you had, the more he could fetch for you. In fact, some of the skills were developed as an investment so that when the slave was sold, he would bring more than was invested in it. Sounds like today, ladies and gentlemen? Sounds like this kind of thing when we are told, and we tell our children to build your marketable skills so that when you go on the auction block in front of your white employers, you can demand a higher price because you can project the skills that he has set in you. What do the French tell us? The more things, the more they remain the same. And this capacity we must maintain, or else we will be deceived by superficial changes, as so many of our people are. Some of you heard me on the radio this morning. You heard some references to Colin Powell as representing some advancement for African people. And yet those of us who have a little knowledge of African history and of the history of the Byzantine Empire know very clearly that there were slave generals. Yes, generals who led massive armies who were slaves. And despite the fact that they were generals and led imperial armies, they were slaves just the same. So the idea then that you're going to have an African man under the power of European and white supremacy being a general, that he represents some kind of power and advancement for black people is a delusion. And I'm certain, if you read people even like Chancellor Williams, and God bless his soul and rest his soul, who talks about those Africanized Arabs also leading those armies against whom? Other Africans. So let's not get carried away about black man being ahead of the U.S. Armed Forces, ladies and gentlemen. Because essentially he's going to play the same role that we've always played when we were promoted to these second-hand positions. That is, leading aggression against our own people. Let's look a minute at the political economy of the personality. You see, before we talk about personality as a psychological entity, ask yourself the question, what is its political and economic function? You see, we got a lot of people get caught up about normality and abnormality and trying to define what is normal and what is not normal. Before you get caught up in asking that question, ask yourself, what is the social function and the political function of normality? You see, in other words then, the personality to a great extent is a political creation and a social creation. So is normality. That is why they are defined differently by different cultures. And that is why what is called normal in one may be normal in the other. And therefore, to a great extent, what is normal and what is abnormal are the results of the interaction of social power and social forces within a society. The personality and abnormality are the results to a great extent of the systematic use of reward and punishment on the bodies of people. Threat and intimidation, control of information, control of interaction and social interaction in such a way that over time people tend, as a result of social conditioning, to behave in particular ways. And often then, those who define what is normal and and what is the normal and what is the normal personality are those in power, and their definition of personality and normality involves then the conditioning of people in such a way that in relating one to the other, in those people perceiving themselves in particular ways, in perceiving the world in particular ways, they maintain a social and economic system. They respond to particular authorities and particular types of stimulation and specific types of signals. Am I making myself clear? And therefore all of what's involved in special education as an indication of deviant personality or as an indication of them abnormality ultimately is built in structure right into the political and economic system of this world. And we must keep this in mind before we just fall for the okie-doke and take what somebody else describes as normal. Ladies and gentlemen, to be a normal black man and woman under white supremacy, according to white definition, is to be sick according to African definition. Yes.
Sorry, I needed something.
Personality and normality involves a particular organization of the person's ways of thinking, the organization of a person's ways of behaving, of seeing the world, of seeing himself, of looking at the world and relating to people in that world. More deeply, it is an organization of people's tastes and interests and desires. And if you look closely at it then, normal people in a particular society will be interested in those things that maintain that society. Will have desires which, if satisfied, maintains the power relations in that society. Am I making myself clear here? Okay? They will be interested in things that maintain power relations. They will define themselves in ways that maintain power relations. The way some black men define themselves today as skirt chasers, as beer drinkers, looking at a TV set, watching men run into each other and fall down. That's a man.
I've been eating those like mad long for years.
Keeping up and being solely obsessed.
Have you ever seen him here before?
Black women?
Exactly.
Solely obsessed, as we say, with playing with balls. Yes. Drinking themselves into a stupor, looking at people running, banging into each other, and get up and run again. Not reading, not studying war, not developing economic power, not developing military power, not learning how to relate and associate with other men and women to form an organization that will be an expression of African power and to liberate African people. That somehow has been made to be perceived by many of our young men and women today as to be engaged in feminine or less than manly activities. And the society is willing to pay black males millions of dollars to maintain those interests. That's why I've told you in other contexts that man has little to do with your penis or your testicles. What is a man has a social definition. It is a political definition. The definition of what is a man must be ultimately connected to the needs of the society itself. so that a man in acting out his manhood is maintaining his social group. If man is not defined, and what it means to be a man is not defined socially and in terms of his social group, then he will not be social but antisocial. And one of the major reasons then our males are attacking our own societies and communities today is because they have not correctly defined what it means to be a man. A normal African man would not kill another man in order to take the money he rifles from his pocket to a white man and give it to him and make him rich so that he can rule over him further. Not normality. In fact, you don't even have to go that far. A normal man, black man, doesn't work day and night only to give his money to a white man. You have to be abnormal. But of course the white man has to make you feel that that is what? Normal. And that is the American way.
No, I had on some cool work socks though. I had on some hockey socks.
Your money. You are now expressing American individualism.
Had the hockey socks.
Sweeping the floor.
And what it means to be free. Isn't it strange? And watch it, ladies and gentlemen, every means by which the normal African American defines his freedom ends up supporting white folk. To prove that he can live anywhere he wants to, he's got to move into a white neighborhood. To prove that he's free to go to any school he wants to, he goes to a white school. To prove that he can spend his money anywhere he wants to because he's a free man, he spends it with white folk. You understand? Yeah. White man feels as free as a bird and feels no compulsion to live among you and does not feel that his freedom is infringed upon at all. Doesn't feel any compulsion to go to school with black folk. He doesn't feel like he's unfree because he's not going to school with you. He doesn't feel as he's unfree because he's not spending money with you, because he's not laying in the bed with you, and all these other kinds of things. But the Negro, in order to feel free and express his freedom, must spend and give his money and his labor power and everything else to everyone else but himself. That establishes him as a free individual and a normal individual. So then normality, you see, ladies and gentlemen, more than a psychological function, is a political and economic function. Because as you express your normality, as you express your law-abidingness, you maintain the system. Yeah. You heard me talk about this morning. Our respect for the law. The law, as if it represents something holy and above all people. The law is nothing but a bunch of rules laid down by one gang of people who have the power to enforce it on another gang. Understand? Nothing sacred about it. And it's passed and ratified to protect group interests, one set of group interests against what? Another set of group interests. That's all it's about. Nothing sacred about it. But you see, if you see law and law-abidingness as indicative of pro-social behavior and indicative of normality, then by obeying that law and looking at law that way, you will have to do what? Maintain the people who passed the law in what? In power. It was until Martin Luther King and others decided that they would do what? Break the law. Okay? Break the law. Be what? Abnormal. That the power relations and the social relations of America began to tumble down. So you have to be careful, you see, how you define yourself. A.R. Luria argues in his book, Cognitive Development, Its Cultural and Social Foundations, and I recommend this highly to those of you who are in education, A.R. Luria, because it demonstrates so very clearly how the mentality of people are shaped very much by the type of social activities they are allowed to engage in, by the type of social and political structure they are conditioned in as people. The science of psychology has avoided the idea that many mental processes are social and historical in origin. Mental processes just don't flow from the brain as a natural effluvia. Mental processes are historical effects and are related to historical experiences, or that important manifestations of human consciousness have been directly shaped by the basic practices of human activity and the actual forms of culture. We have to recognize it, and we don't have time to go into this evening. When the new publication in a few months comes out, Educating Black Children for the 21st Century, we will find in there detailed what is being stated here, of how the mentality and consciousness of our people is very directly related to the experience of our people in America, and how teachers, what you call concrete thinking in African children in these schools, is directly related to the fact that African people were brought over here not to think, not plan, not to conceptualize, not to control, but to work and to do what? Concrete things. And the whole thrust of the American experience is to seek to shape the thinking styles of African people to fit the role that white people made for them. And therefore, if the roles of African people was to be that of practical workers, concrete workers, then it was in the interest of Europeans to make their mentality concrete and practical rather than conceptual and abstract. But you see, if you don't know this history, and if you don't know the dynamics of how this mentality has been created, and if you don't know the political economy of thought, then when these children come into your schools and they demonstrate what you call concrete thinking, lack of planning, and lack of conceptual thought, you are ready then to label them as learning disabled and relate to them in terms of being learning disabled. I'll be back to that in a minute. The manifestations of African consciousness is directly shaped or influenced by the social political practices and forms of American culture, shaped by the social power relations of white and black people. You know that if we had a different power relationship with white folk, we wouldn't think and behave the way we do now. No, we would act differently and behave differently. To a great extent then, the things we talk about, the things we're interested in, the way we look at ourselves, and all of these kinds of things are a product of the nature of the power relations that have adhered between us and white folk. Imagine how you would be if we were the more powerful ones. In fact, we wouldn't be having this lecture tonight. It wouldn't even be a subject matter. We'd be talking about how we could keep it. And how we could protect what? African interests. Right now, we have to talk about how we're going to take it. These relations, these power relations have and are guided by social and legal definitions and rules and their enforcement by whites. These definitions and rules provide standards and ways of judging others as deviants or non-deviants, of transforming an instance of conduct into a deviant or non-deviant act. I want you to keep in mind what I'm talking about in terms of rules, you see, and definitions, because it's what is defined as learning disabled, you see. What is defined as in being in need of special education. And that definition being based on the exhibition of certain types of behavior, and then stigmatizing people based on this behavior. Even though when you get to really look at it, ladies and gentlemen, the behavior is not deviant or non-deviant. These definitions and rules serve a dual function. They provide for the labeling of others and supply the means and the authority to stigmatize the behavior of others. You will recognize as we go on then that when you permit others to label behavior, your own behavior, you are giving them a power over you. And it will be that label which will authorize them to do certain things to you and about you. So they are not just labels, but they are the justifiers of behavior. And they prescribe various behaviors toward those who are labeled. Consequently, definitions and rules are expressions of group, conflict, and interest. I want you to keep that in mind. Labels are not just labels of behavior. Labels are entered into as a part of the interaction between groups. I don't want you to do this, therefore I will make it against the law. And when you do it, I shall call you a criminal. You see? And so, what do we have here? And why am I making this law? And why am I calling you a criminal? So that I can protect what? My interests. You see? And can justify myself in treating you in a particular way so that my interests can be protected. And the formulation, this formulation of rules and definitions translate into power to impose one group's will on the other. The power to define and enforce one group's definition on the other's conduct. And this is what this is about. If you look back in your old Bible there, you will see that Adam is symbolically given the power to dominate the earth by God, by the fact that God permits him to do what? Name all the animals, the fish and the fowl, and to name the earth itself. That is a power. And this is a symbol. By saying this, he is saying, you are the one who dominates the world, because I'm going to permit you to define the world, to name it, and to relate to it in terms of the way you define it and name it. This then will give you the right to impose yourself on nature and to impose yourself on the world. Consequently, when you let another people have the right to define your behavior, you let them also have the right to impose themselves on you. And it's amazing what happens when you have definition. You talk about, some of you are familiar with the book Regulating the Poor. It's interesting how so-called normal behavior can in an instant be turned into abnormal behavior by the mere act of labeling. How, for instance, some of you may have gone to Boston, you heard something called the Common Gardens, or the Boston Common Gardens, a park, which harks back to a European tradition where certain lands belong to all of the people. And the peasants then had the right to hunt on those lands, to fish, to find their firewood, to do various things, to graze their cattle, and so forth, as a means of supporting themselves. They had that right. And this right was sanctioned by tradition over hundreds and hundreds of years. But something happened. The price of wool started increasing tremendously and became very profitable. And those who were in power decided then that they wanted as much land as possible. And they went to the British Parliament to get a law passed so that they could enclose what was once common property and fence it off and make this property private. And therefore, overnight now, those people who had been bringing their cattle and doing these things in their normal way were turned into what? Criminals. Criminals. Why? Because their behavior was different? Because they were emitting criminal behavior? No, because the rules had changed. Right overnight, now they became criminals. And as the price of wool went up, and as the English economy changed, when these landowners no longer needed the peasants on the land, and when they needed them in the developing factories, they literally turned them out into the highways and the byways. And overnight they became beggars. But also overnight it became against the law to beg without a license. And overnight, it was all right then to, if you didn't have a license, to be beaten until the blood ran. And overnight then, it became possible to talk about the personality of the beggar. And to see the person, the beggar, as having a criminal personality. No doubt built into his genes. Yeah, the same kind of game that we have today. A group of people interested in their profits and interested in maintaining power and control pass laws, and overnight then the behavior of our people suddenly becomes what? Criminal and abnormal. And now the same behavior that they were exhibiting before the laws were called become indicative of criminal personalities and of illness and abnormality. Let's wake up.
You're not leaving, right?
Hmm?
And notice then that the labeling and defining of behavior, again, not essentially and only a psychological process, but it is a psychopolitical, psychoeconomic process.
Just stop.
As a matter of fact, I will give you a short publication to read shortly called The Psychoeconomics of Black on Black Violence. You thought I was through with it, didn't you? Oh, I knew when I wrote the psychodynamics of black on black violence that wasn't all of it. No, black on black violence is determined more than internal psychodynamics. Because you must recognize those psychodynamics are a reflection of economic dynamics. They are the psychological reflection of economic demands and of an economic system. They do not, therefore, begin in the psyche of African people. They begin the very economic structure of European people. And it acts itself out through their behavior. Because the purpose of that system is to organize black behavior, as I said earlier, to maintain itself. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, when you get over your anger with Elijah Muhammad, and your unwillingness to analyze who he was because you can't get beyond some act you think, just destroys everything he was about. And you fall into a trap when you do this. I call this super niggerism. When all of those who may have achieved some position of leadership or influence must be perceived as totally and superly clean and must not be perceived as having one chink of a flaw in their personality. There is no man who is unflawed. He who is without sin, cast the first stone. And yet when you demand of your leaders that they be totally saints and total saints, then all your enemy has to do is put one little smudge of dirt on them. And everything of value that they have to offer now is thrown out. And no lessons are learned. Yes. And the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is due a good analysis of his leadership and what he had to offer black people, regardless of what you may think. Because the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was the greatest psychologist that black people ever created, bar none. But you see, that sounds odd if you haven't taken time to get around your anger, to look at what was going on there. You understand? When you look at the mythologies of Islam as just mythologies, without looking at them in their political and economic function, it was not an issue as to whether the white man was a true devil or not, which he is. But what would be the result of our behavior if we perceived him as one? You see? If we related to him, what? As one. Not as an object to be merged with, to be assimilated with, to be integrated with, but as one to be pushed away. And one so that we could engage in our own self-development instead of trying to create ourselves to fit his image of who we should be. You thought Elijah Muhammad was hard when he dictated diet and taste, but your taste had already been dictated by the Europeans. And it had been dictated in such a way that you became gluttons for European things. And being glutton for European things, you gave them all of your money. You gave them more than you even earned. That's why you're in debt today. And in giving away and feeding your gluttonous appetites that the Europeans had inculcated in you, you had no money left to educate your children. No money left to invest in your businesses. No money left to support your families and the other social institutions. And now you wonder why your children are stabbing you in the streets and robbing you. And Elijah Muhammad then said, we will change their taste. Let them eat bean pie. Let them get a taste for this kind of clothing. Let them get an interest in this. Let them lose their taste for alcohol. Let them lose their taste for cigarettes. Let them lose their taste for junk food. Let them eat once a day. Why? Because they spend from $2,000 to $5,000 a year per person buying junk and garbage. And therefore, with that savings, they can build their own institutions, universities of Islam across this country. But you see, when you let other people determine your perception of your own leaders, you fall back to be victimized by those people and fall back into your old habits, which of course lead to supporting them. And we have to understand then what this is about. This is why ultimately you see an African-centered education is not a mere teaching of African history and culture, but ultimately a reorganization of the African personality and a reorganization of African taste and interest such that Africans become self-supporting and self-sufficient and become a powerful people. So you have to be careful, you see. Black people are absolutists. Yeah, we're absolutists, you know. It doesn't matter whether you're Christian or Marxist or whatever religion or whatever you belong to, when it comes from other people. We hear something and we believe it because it's absolutely true. You see? Yeah, that's true. And you know, and we dedicate ourselves to it. That's irrefutable. Yeah. This will get you in trouble. You know, again, you Christians, Thomas says, Lord, I believe, but help thou my what? Unbelief. Don't make me believe too much. You got to prove something to me. You just can't come back here and tell me that you got off the cross, man. Show me the doggone. Yeah, let me see something here. You see, we just can't take it on your what? Your word. But you see, the idea of the European is to get us to take him on his what? Word. And he handed us the word. Yeah. And he ended up, though, what did we say? With the land and everything else. Why? Because we believe the word only. Absolutely. Because the word to us appeared true. Now let me quickly show you what I mean by this. A European walks up and says, we shouldn't really see each other in terms of race. We're all human, and the globe belongs to all of mankind. We shouldn't really relate to each other in terms of nationalities. We should be free to move across the earth as we see fit. And we should be free to invest wherever there are opportunities to invest. All of us should have that right. That's called free market. Yeah, free market economy. Oh yeah, that's right, that's right. And of course we're glad to hear from him, you know, oh, this man has become civilized at last. But wait a minute, you see, you gotta ask something. Even
Alright guys, we about to get out of here. Thanks for chilling. Still working my way on this piece. And I'll catch you guys next time.